Hello and welcome. Hopefully you can see that screen quite well. I want to take you on a bit of a journey. It's been about a 20-year journey for me with sort of reef science, but it's also one of the reasons, I guess, why I've landed up in Stockholm at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. I think something that Ian finds more complex than a lot of the socio-ecological systems that he measures as to why I would leave a sun-drenched reef and magnetic island and come to Stockholm. But hopefully by the end you'll have some feeling as to why that's the case. So unlike perhaps a lot of talks, I'm going to start off with a few slides, because in many cases we think of reefs as being somewhat objective. They're objective objects that we can sort of put into a scientific framework and model them or describe them in some sort of metric system. We often forget just how beautiful and wonderful they really are. And for anyone who's been on the reef, and I think hopefully most of you have had some chance to actually get under the water and have a look, then you'll understand what I'm saying, that it's not just a simple case of science, it's a case of society addressing something very beautiful. So there's a couple of slides here, and the light's not going to do me any favour, but you'll get the picture. You can go diving in quite a few parts of the world where you see this. There's lots of different life forms on the bottom, lots of different fish, and the most interesting thing about being a coral reef scientist above anything else is that the animals just ignore you. They don't run away scared like they do on the land. They often come up, have a look. The visibilities can be, well, fantastic, and the fish can be quite spectacular, all sorts of different colours. And a lot of the traditional reef looks like this, but normally near the surface. And this is a photo I took in Davies Reef. A lot of different coral forms, a lot of different fish that use those forms. But don't forget about the rocky reefs as well, which I spent a lot of time on. The ones down south, particularly in the temperate waters. And those reefs are equally beautiful if you have enough energy to go and have a look. They're obviously colder, but still the sponges and the ascidians and bits and pieces are often really quite spectacular. There's lots of different life forms, you know, the sea dragons, and all mixed around in this great big sea of kelp, which moves, which can be quite unnerving if you're not used to it. You can also sort of poke your head into different caves and spots and sort of see the animals that use those areas. In particular too, you can get to watch the animals play, something that's very difficult to see in terrestrial systems, that, you know, seals, for instance, diving around and playing. However, we looked at all these systems and found them to be quite spectacular, but in recent years we've found more and more examples of the next few slides. We started seeing things like cyclone damage, where very large plates, you know, this plate is, a copper plate here is larger than myself. It's just been flipped over by a cyclone. Whole corals smashed to bits. And some of the surveys I was doing with the Barrier Reef Marine Park, we were going and there was nothing left. It had just been removed. We started seeing crown of thorn starfish regularly coming and eating everything they possibly could, bar perhaps the big parietes. And we started seeing bleaching, where the corals turn white because they lose all their photosynthetic companions. Interesting enough, the tourists loved it in certain spots because the corals go pinks and whites, and it's very beautiful. We also started seeing some disease in cases where people who'd been surveying for years hadn't seen these diseases. They're becoming common to the point where you could go and see disease. You know, it was not a hard thing to find. So in about 1998, these two publications were released. The Reefs at Risk one, which was essentially a way of mapping how the reefs around the world were performing, and also another one by Clive Wilkinson, using a whole heap of local knowledge to pull in sort of this status of the coral reefs. And this is very much a local-based type products. These papers, and publications that came from this time were really saying how well were people managing the reefs. And I can remember at the time people were talking about, oh, the Barrier Reef, it's the best managed reef in the world. Nothing can sort of happen like this. You know, it's kind of almost bomb-proof. But this feeling here was that there was a local issue that needed to be addressed, overfishing, particularly dynamite fishing, and a whole range of bits and pieces. However, there was a big wake-up call in 1998, about the same time, with some coral bleaching. Initially, when I was working there, I had my whole workload shifted because the first coral bleaching in 1998 was, within the GBR, was pretty much along the coast. And there were very few reefs affected. One or two inland reefs went white and died. But in general, the main barrier reef was not really affected. Later on, 2002, we had the same event occur again. And this time, the reef in the central section were affected, and there was a lot of damage, extensive. And it wasn't just the barrier reef, it was around the world. We were seeing an enormous amount of damage, some reefs being completely wiped out, and in some cases still recovering from this event. At that moment, we were very much thinking that the reefs were going to disappear within our lifetimes. Within the next 10, 20 years, people like Charlie Veron were saying they're going to go. You know, if this is going to happen every few years, there's going to be nothing left. Thankfully, there hasn't been that catastrophic sequence yet. The temperatures are warming, but there hasn't been some of these bigger bleaching events in such a dramatic form as this. But it was a real wake-up call to the Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority that they were part of a global community. It wasn't just local. Even though they managed things locally, it wasn't just a local issue. And there were some great papers, including by Carl, which really brought home the issue that there is a global problem. It wasn't just about how you managed your fishing in your local area. We were going to have to address this at a global level. Really, up until then, most of our research had been on a lot of taxonomic work. We had quite a few taxonomists working for us, and a lot of my own work was looking at how do you manage taxonomic data. And we went out and we surveyed this and we surveyed that and we collected more species. And in one sense, we were trying to build these types of maps, which is a species density map of coral. It could also almost be of fish, but in this case it's coral. And we are very keen to come up with ideas about how do you describe a particular species, where does it live, what's its range. That sort of thing was very interesting to us. But now the focus was very different. If the whole world was at risk, what were we going to do? And one of the publications we produced was the coral triangle. We actually took a few years to get this out and running, but it was produced in a Japanese journal, Galaxia. And the early work we did for that became the foundation of this big coral reef initiative, which they've put in a large amount of money. And the reason being is they figured if they couldn't save all the reefs, given the global nature of it, then they might as well save the best. And the best seem to exist in a triangle that sort of goes up to top here, comes down across Indonesia, goes across and around Papua New Guinea and back up. The early coral triangle, I might add, didn't include Papua New Guinea, but then they sort of did some more surveys and realised that this area was also quite fantastic. This was a huge change in thinking, because everyone had thought that the Great Barrier Reef was the greatest. You know, if you wanted to see the best and the best, you went to the Great Barrier Reef. In fact, the Great Barrier Reef is actually not the greatest. There's about 340 species existing here, whereas here in some of these areas, like Raja Ampat, it's possible to go and survey 500 plus, 540 species of coral. So clearly, there was a rethinking on how to prioritise the money basically required to reshape what we were doing with these reefs. So a lot of time was spent, and this is one of the publications we put out, trying to prioritise how do you invest in trying to preserve coral reefs. This particular paper was looking at how do you address the threats of coral reefs. So if you can take away the threats, hopefully the corals, kind of leave them alone, they'll do okay. And in many cases that's not a bad option, but it very much focuses back to the local scale. The local people have the right to sort of make that work. However, a lot of people had realised they weren't very sure about what the outcomes were. You know, it's all very well to talk about taking away the threats, but what are you going to achieve? What's going to be the sort of the end goal? And so this raised some big questions about what actually was the end goal. What do we want to protect? The Coral Triangle said, you know, it's species, it's the number of species. So there was a bit of a debate happening, and I'll just step you through that a little. First of all is species richness. We all know that it's good to have a lot of species. It's better than having one species, just one fish or something like that. It's nice to have lots of different species. But then we have to question ourselves, is it better to have, say, lots of species in one area, and then say maybe one area that's just got one or two species, and some of the deeper reefs only have a small number of species. They're less. Does that make them better for conservation or not? It's a difficult question. We do know, however, though, that when we look at the fish, they're not all the same. They're very much in a functional way. There's all different shapes and sizes, and they do all sorts of different things. And in one sense, we can group them by what's called functional richness, where we look at, you know, what they eat, how they eat it, whether they're nocturnal, gregarious, where they live, try to get some sense of the roles that the fish play. And we can compare those two together, you know, the functional richness versus species, and we're coming to the point now where we know that they're not the same. At one level, we know that species that are rich but are more diverse, like we might have a lot of different small ones here, but only a small number of other sort of functions. We might have a richness which is not representative. So what's the issue here is that we're looking at this from a human perspective now, is that we want to say, well, is it better to have lots of species or ones that are functionally complete? And so some work that was done with basically led by Graham Edgar and Rick Stewart Smith said, let's have a look at the reefs of the world and see what the patterns are, see what the general patterns are. And when they did so, they realised that to survey the reefs of the world required an enormous amount of people power to do so. You can't really do that these days in an organisational framework because the cost of doing so becomes so difficult. What you can do, though, is use citizens who are both capable and very keen and are willing to put their own money into the venture. And so we had people around the world who go through a rigorous training scheme to join this Reef Life Survey group. And when they're sort of certified, their data is used to sort of help understand the reefs you can see around here. So the black dots represent where we'd surveyed, and obviously being an Australian initiative, they did a lot of work around Australia, but they also did a lot of work in different parts of the world, including right up north and right down south. So what did they find? Well, this is a brief glimpse. I don't expect you to see the detail. You can have a look at the maps in the paper if you like, but essentially the species density, richness, species richness is very much along the lines of what we'd already known. No surprises. The functional group richness was also pretty much the same, very much concentrated in the tropics, and particularly with species. I guess the coral triangle has some merit. There's lots of fish there, lots of coral. It's a real hot spot of biodiversity. But when we looked at species evenness, we start to see a different pattern. We see that the tropics are actually not they're not as even as other places. In many cases, they're dominated by one or two functional groups, as opposed to the more higher latitude areas, which tend to have a more of an even spread of function. So they came up with an index which was quite interesting. It's essentially saying, grab some of the information from each of these panels and combine it with abundance, and then you have functional diversity, which is an abundance-weighted functional grouping. And this changes our perspective of the global reefs, because it starts to sort of say, well, there's other places around the world, not just the coral triangle, that are worth preserving. They've got lots of fish, they're spread over a large area, a large functional area, and they occupy different spots around the world, mostly associated with vigorous upwelling or nutrient loading where the fish and the activity can really thrive. So this raises a great question of how do you protect such diversity if it's spread across the world? And in many cases, there's been a big push, and for a while there, Australia was very much leading the game with the reserves. And a lot of concern was in place that when they went out to a lot of these reefs around the world, is they might be a marine reserve, but they seem to be basically next to useless. So again, this very similar group, based on the same citizen science, went out and surveyed around the world for those same areas. It wasn't a repeat, I mean, it's like part of the same survey. And they particularly looked at 87 marine protected areas. So no one had ever done such a rigorous survey of so many reserves before. So that gave them enormous statistical power to then look at the differences. So they looked at the fish particularly, but they looked at benthic structure as well. And there's more and more papers coming out about that. But I'm just going to focus on the fish for the minute. So they looked at things like total biomass of large fish, which are obviously targeted by fisheries, some species richness, large species richness, the biomass of sharks, gropers, jacks and damselfish. It's fairly honourable that this group's also making their data available in the middle of this year. So anyone will be able to, via the internet, essentially download whatever they want of the survey data and do any sorts of modelling that might either reflect their own local interest or perhaps even global. I have little doubt that this type of data will spawn vigorous science in matching to, for instance, global data sets about chlorophyll and nutrient levels, that sort of thing. So the survey was a lot of fun. I participated in some of the surveys in the coral area, going out to the Coral Sea, where we sailed out and surveyed quite a few of the very isolated reefs. It was quite a special time. In some of the areas we're in, we'd have large sharks and manta rays and things all sort of literally pushing us out of the way. For those of you who haven't done much diving where there's large sharks, these sharks are completely harmless, very curious, but of no threat to humans. Although there have been, sometimes they get a bit territorial, but in general they're quite happy just to sort of leave you alone. It's quite a marvelous program to be able to go and survey some of the most remote and wonderful places of the world. So, however, there were some difficulties. One of the people I was with had an absolute phobia of snakes, was petrified of snakes, and we went to Maria Island, to Maria Reef, which is just off Australia. It's very, very isolated. It took us literally 2 days to sail out there. It's an interesting reef, but one of the most interesting parts was it's full of sea snakes. Every single survey we did, every single dive, we had these guys coming up to us and interacting with us. They're very curious. If you haven't dived with sea snakes before, sea snakes don't just look at you and move away. They want to kind of see what's going on. And in particularly, this person, she really freaked out. And so my job was to swim behind her as part of the surveying and to keep the sea snakes off her. And a few times I wasn't successful because of course I've got, you know, reels and cameras and stuff. And a few times, like this one here, had wrapped itself around her leg. But because of the wetsuit, she didn't feel it. So I was in a terrible dilemma swimming behind her. Make sure she doesn't look backwards, but at the same time, should I try and pull the sea snake off? Eventually, in this particular case, yeah, the sea snake wasn't moving at all, so I thought I grabbed it. So I grabbed the tail, and the sea snake doesn't like that very much. You've got to be a little bit careful because they're actually more venomous than land-based snakes. So this is not, you've got to be a little bit careful, but they've got tiny heads, and in general they don't tend to bite. But yeah, quite a special part of the world. So we looked at all these marine protected areas, and in particular we looked at a number of characteristics. So we looked, for instance, at what type of fishing was going on, whether it was no-take, some fishing, commercial fishing, a real mixture of what was being used. And there's some papers coming out about the types of fishing gear being used as well. We also looked at how they're enforced. Clearly, this is a big issue, as you know, around the world, enforcement about fisheries, and it doesn't stop there. We looked also at how long the reef has been protected for. It seems to be a significant part of it. We looked at how big the area is. And we also noted whether or not the reef structure itself was inside the reserve. There was quite a few of the reserves were split in half. So, for instance, you might get this top half is a green zone, but the bottom half can be fished. Well, that's not so good. So we looked at those 5 features. And no-take, enforced, old, large, and isolated in terms of it's isolated from other areas. Those 5 features we've called Neoldi. Actually, originally I put up Leone, but Graham argued very successfully that the 2 features that are the most important to promote are the N and the E, the no-take and enforced, because you can do something about that without there being any great, change in life, and they make a big difference. So if you get those 5 features done, then you can get big results. And here's the results, and I apologise, you're not really going to be able to see much more from there, but it doesn't really matter too much. The first one is biomass. This is biomass of all the species. And these along the bottom here, these are how many Neoldi features there are. So the first one's 0. So that's basically saying it's fished zone. It's the sort of what you'd expect for many parts of the world. And as you go along, you'll see that we've got a couple more extra features. So for biomass, for the first couple of extra features, maybe it's large, maybe it's been in place for a while, but maybe it's not enforced, maybe it's not no-take. It makes absolutely no difference to the fish biomass compared to surrounding areas that were allowed to be fished. And this was the story we found right through, that for the first 3 or so features, it's really completely ineffective. And we found that 59% of the marine reserve areas we surveyed were no better in terms of biomass, no better than the areas we saw in areas that were being fished. So in other words, they were useless. They're just paper parks in the classic term. It's particularly notable that when we look at biomass of the fish that are quite large, that initially no difference at all, but when you get to those marine protected areas that have 5 features, and even the ones with 4, you see a dramatic increase. This is a 1,000% change, 1,000% change in general for those reefs. So while there's obviously a lot of concern, that a lot of paper parks, the big, hopefully positive message is that when these marine reserves are done properly, they work exceptionally well. And the examples are quite unique. And in fact, it's an interesting revelation that apart from the Australian ones, most of the other reserves that were doing really well are in developing countries. The ones who can least afford to be so relaxed about, you know, protein issues. So it was quite a credit to Chile and a few of those other countries that they're actually the ones who are having some of the big successes here. The other big message, some of the species numbers, they make a bit of a difference, but not a lot. Species seem to compensate quite well. And again, even for the large species, it does help, but it's not such a dramatic difference as the biomass. The other message, and I was talking to Magnus about this, is that it doesn't actually matter which of those Neoli features you get right. Isolation is a little bit more useful, but in some cases, you can choose any of those 5 and come up with a kind of a pool, and you end up with pretty good result if you look at it like this. So we did some mapping where we basically said, well, if we understand some of those features and we understand a lot of the drivers, we can select 15 or so global environmental features, including a population model, and nutrients and phosphorus levels and all sorts of things that are currently freely available to download for the entire world. So we were able to look at those and run them through a statistical mechanism to allow us to sort of model where you might see different species, for instance, for all fish or for larger. And in many cases, the coral triangle has had a lot of the area reduced. It's no longer becoming the hub of species diversity. It's really those areas that are becoming sort of the isolated, in a couple of areas protected, which really is starting to shelter the species diversity. Biomass is even worse off. In many cases, the biomass has been stripped from many of the coral triangle areas, pushed to those regions that are hard to get to or locally controlled, and occupying areas like in Australia, where it's in the Western Australia here, where no one goes to. It's pretty much free of people. And I've got a few statistics here at the bottom, which I'm going to come back to at the very end. But based on that comparison modelling, 63% of fish biomass gone. 80% large biomass gone, not there. 97% of shark biomass was removed. This was really weird for us because at one level we thought we'd made a mistake. You know, how can the shark levels be so badly decimated from marine protected areas to areas that are being fished. Surely sharks were moving around all over the place, and they'd move outside of the reserves, you know, even if it was 100 kilometres square, they'd move and they would get fished. Where's the logic in that? It appears that sharks are actually quite home-based. They do, of course, swim around, but in many cases they have a reef that is their home. And I'll talk a little bit about that near the end. So we looked at those, a global prediction model. You don't need to read those other than saying that they're the same things like the biomass for large fish species, large sharks, gropers, jacks and damselfish. Damselfish being our sort of control species at one clumsy level. And we were looking at that and thinking to ourselves, well, that's really interesting, because when we go to model some of those species, one of the key drivers coming from our data is that a population index is very important. That it's a model I came up with where we're able to literally sort of spill the land-based populations out into the ocean and get a sense of how they're interacting with their coral reefs and temperate reefs. So the population is clearly a major driver for a lot of the changes that we're seeing. And as you all know, it's very much all linked together. This is a size-based trophic web, and it's very complicated. Lots of different species interacting, all different sizes, and humans are interacting with every single level. We are eating and mining these. We are putting out nutrients which are changing these levels, and there's all sorts of interactions going at the middle level as well. So this raises some interesting areas about how do you model such complexity. And some work being done on the data set itself is using this thing called biomass spectra. Biomass spectra is a way of simplifying down trophic networks, because when you look at them, like I showed you before, they're very difficult to sort of use. Because of the complexity, we struggle with them. So what we can do here is we can look at essentially the change, and in this case I've got a body mass along the bottom here. So we've got big fish here, little fish, or in this case phytoplankton here, and on the other axis we have biomass. How much is there of those ones? And of course, for most people, you'd understand that as an animal eats, it grows bigger, but there's a loss. You know, we don't directly convert all energy from one trophic level to another trophic level. There's this natural loss. But you can measure the slopes and make an interpretation of them, particularly if they're heavily sloped. In other words, the top predators are really squashed, lots of little guys, but not much in the big ones. And if you've been to Philippines and dived there, you know exactly what I mean. This is a big fish. You know, this is a very big fish, and this is what you'll see. So in those areas, the fishing pyramid is very much squashed like this. In many other cases, it's fairly, you know, it's kind of more standard, as you'd expect. And in some cases, don't forget this is log scale. And in other cases, it's actually tilted. And this is called subsidized. And this is where we expect essentially the fish are living on reefs, but the bigger fish, and in some cases other smaller fish, are going off the reef, getting food from somewhere else, and then coming back to the reef. So when you survey the reef, there is more fish than you would expect if it was just based on some sort of energetic system. And this is what we see. So it's a small map here of just sort of the sites, the survey, just really to sort of remind myself that you know, there are still large areas of the world that haven't been surveyed, and we do expect to fill some of those gaps. You know, it's not a complete program in some ways. We do notice though that when we look at the spectra, that we see this big tropical zone, and we see that reefs in the tropics tend to be fairly flat in their spectra, which means the reefs are fairly much like a pyramid. Most of the fish stay attached to the reef. You get a few moving around, a few sharks and things that go out, some of the mackerel that might go out and hunt. But in general, the reefs in the tropics tend to be locked in place. The fish tend to want to stay with the coral, and that tends to be what we see. These lines here represent all the surveys that were done in the tropics. So it's in this case about 7,000 lines, to give you an idea. It's quite a robust sample. In the temperate areas though, we do notice that there's a significant tilt upwards, which tends to mean that the biomass is inverted. And it's not really surprising when you think about it. If you've been out into the hot tropical waters, they're fairly poor. There's not much there. You know, they really are deserts. If you go away from the reefs, you don't see very much. There's not much because there's not very little nutrients. There might be lots of heat, but there's not the big bioactivity that we see in some of the coasts along Chile, for instance. So these reefs that are down south are showing this trend because the reefs themselves are acting as habitats, but the nutrient-rich waters nearby are able to support some of the life that we see there. And this gives us a really good, nice expectation of what the community structure should be. But it brings us around in a whole circle to sort of how do we deal with the problem of conservation. And this is some work in progress that I'm doing. It's looking at essentially 4 elements. The first is the red. I'm not sure if you can see it from back there, but essentially there's red dots, yellow dots, green and blue dots. So the red dots are the consumer cities. They're the cities that are eating the fish. They're located within 100 kilometres of a fishing city, which is those ones that are on the coast that are able to go out and do some fishing on the reefs. The green dots represented the reefs that were surveyed by the Reef Life Survey, and the blue dots represent those ones that are inside some sort of marine protected area. And this is a global map. So this represents all the reefs around the world, all the human populations that are interacting with those reefs, and it gives you a sense of the complexity of the issue. This is not something that you can just go ahead to some degree with some sort of recipe-driven approach. We see some cases, like here, we've got a large number of reserves, some areas that get fished, a small fishing village, a series of small fishing villages, followed by a smaller number of people, whereas in some parts of Indonesia and South America, we see very large numbers of people, like here. A small number of reefs, a reasonably small number of fished villages, and only a couple of reserves. These consumer cities, in my view, and I've only got early data yet, so I didn't want to present it too much because it's not as robust as I'd like yet, but the amount of consumer pressure on the fishing villages to supply seems to be having a major I guess a major correlation with the biomass that we're seeing on the nearby reefs. So in other words, it's not just good enough to look at the reefs, we really need to look at the humans that are associated with those reefs. So, very much at the end, I've told the last slide, or second last slide or so, 369 were in decline, and that actually sort of, I don't know why it came to me, but I quite like it. But if you're not used to the 369, it's 3 degrees of heating, of warmth that we're going to be exposed to. It's the 6th extinction, which we're very much seeing at the moment. And it's the 9 billion people that we're expecting to see by roughly 2050. If you take those three parameters alone, it's not good news. It's very hard to be optimistic, I mean, quite frankly. Particularly like if you look at this, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, they list something as critically endangered if it has 80% reduction. Now, that's somewhat controversial if you have a fish, if you apply this to fish who are being exploited, but certainly our results tend to highlight that potentially all large fish in the world's oceans are critically endangered. So it's interesting that for the first time we know what to do. As a human species, we know what to do. That's kind of pretty obvious. We know where to do it. We know why to do it. You know, it's good for society. It has a whole range of ecosystem services. I didn't go into those because if you don't know that, you're not likely to be sitting here. But the question that we don't know very well is how to implement it. And in a sense, this is kind of why I've come to the Stockholm Resilience Centre, because the implementation side is very much on the social human side. And we need to get a better understanding of how we can make sense of what all the science that we've done the last 100 years and tie that into having something that's a little bit more successful, because clearly what we're doing is only marginally successful. So I'd just like to finish with a quick acknowledgement to Oyen and Mistra through program Ecolim, looking at governance, University of Tasmania people, and some James Cook people as well. So, thank you.